Okay, great. Yeah, we were sort of glued to the TV all day. And so most of you know that it was kind of a big deal that an American, for the first time in 31 years, won the men's event. I was fairly new to Boston the last time this happened. I was still trying to make sense of Boston and this marathon thing and why it was so important to people. I understand it rather better now. Anyway, there was a great deal of jubilation, but there was also, some people at least who were sort of questioning whether Meb Keflezighi, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name correctly, is an American, because he was born in Eritrea and he came here at the age of 12 and I think living in San Diego, went to UCLA. So I happened after most of the race coverage to tune into whatever channel the local sports radio station actually televises its afternoon show, and it's Michael Felger and Tony Maserati. And Tony Maserati, who was a baseball expert, was a Tufts student a long time ago. He was a classics major, I believe, and now he's a baseball reporter and radio personality, so you never know what a classics background will do for you. But he was, I think, in a somewhat humorous and soft way, wondering whether this guy was really an American. And the other two radio announcers were basically challenging him and saying, he grew up in this country. He was an adolescent in this country. He's lived most of his life and became an adult in this country. Of course he's an American. And I expect that most people would agree with that. But what it sort of gets at is the fact that our society is in a time in which things are changing. And those kinds of changes can be embraced by some and feared or resented by others. Some of the acrimony around the debate about reforms in immigration law have to do with the anxiety that some people are feeling about just how visibly and rapidly our society is changing in so many ways. As an historian, this is sort of amusing because my sense is that it's always that way. The society is always undergoing these changes and always sort of wrestling with it and perhaps divided by it. And I suspect that, both my grandfathers were immigrants who came over from parts of Eastern Europe. They were Jewish immigrants at the beginning of the 20th century. One came from Lithuania, one came from what's now Ukraine, but I think it was part of Russia at that time. And they came in part fleeing persecution. My father's father survived a pogrom in the city of Odessa, and that was sort of it for him. And he ended up doing what many people do today on our southern border, which is he paid a coyote, that's what we would call it today, to take him over the border so he could get the hell out of there. And so he left for both social, political reasons, but also I think because there was going to be opportunity, he hoped, in America if he could make it there. How many people in this room are descended from immigrants within the last 3 or 4 generations? Almost everybody. So clearly, and yet I will bet that most of you feel completely American. I grew up thinking I was English, just because that's who you were sort of supposed to root for in the stories. So somehow, one more story is sort of personal. My uncle, who was the son of my grandfather who fled from Ukraine, ended up late in his life writing a story about the small town in Pennsylvania that he grew up in and that my father grew up in. Except that my father, like almost every young man of his generation, who went off to the Second World War, never came back to this small town. They went to the big city and they had modern American lives. My uncle, for whatever reason, went back after the war to this town that he came from. And as he grew older, basically watched the town change in ways that he couldn't make sense of. And so what had once been a place with this large and flourishing community of Jewish immigrants, more than 100, by the time my uncle passed away, there were 3 left. 3 old Jewish men who could no longer have a minyan, therefore could not hold services, and therefore they donated the synagogue to be a kind of community center in the town. But my uncle wrote an essay about this, that most of which was lovely because it was about the, I would say, the success of an immigrant community. And part of that success was that most of them ended up assimilating and ultimately moving on. And what my uncle was bitter about at the end of his life was the fact that the town was now mostly occupied by new immigrants, blacks and Asians, and this to him, he just couldn't make sense of how the world that he knew was gone and this new world had taken its place. And no matter how I tried to convince him that what he had described in this essay was the story of the success of one group, and that now he should be excited about the next group, and they too would eventually succeed in that way, but he had a hard time seeing that because he only knew the world that he knew. I'm telling you all this because I think it's relevant to what we're going to be talking about today, which is, well, I called it Barbarians at the Gates, which was meant to sort of be exciting and allude to too many movies that you've seen, but I also called it the sort of the fall of the Roman and Chinese empires, although some people would take issue with the term fall, and they might think that something like transformation is a more appropriate way to describe the changes that happen, the changes that almost always happen. But politically, it's true that the Han Dynasty and, in a sense, the unified China that they had ruled for 400 years sort of fell apart by the early 3rd century CE. And the Roman Empire lasted somewhat longer into the 5th century CE, but eventually it collapsed, or at least part of it collapsed, because in both cases, people survive, civilization survives, but there are political changes. So we're going to be sort of looking at that today. And ultimately, the reasons for these falls, quote unquote, are complex. They involve some combination of external and internal causes. Internal causes meaning political things like struggles over the succession, coups, assassinations, civil wars, corruption, mismanagement, and so forth, economic failures, all of the things that happen on the inside. And then externally, we're talking in particular about the pressure on the empires from other peoples, whom they would have called barbarians, pressing on them from the frontiers, whether they were raiding and stealing, or whether they were trying to move into the territory of the empire. And so both the internal and external factors are part of the reason. We're going to start by looking at the external, but hopefully get to some of both. And I used the word barbarian a moment ago. And I put it sort of in quotation marks here, if only to alert you to the fact that it's obviously a kind of loaded word. And the word comes from the Greek. Barbaros in Greek is early on used for people who are different from you. And it's thought that they were called barbaros because they just went bar, and syllables that didn't make any sense. So that language was one of the big and obvious things that distinguishes Greeks from other people. So early on, the Greek term barbaros or barbarian just means other. People who speak a different language, have different clothing, different cooking, different gods, different values, who are different from us. And early on, it does not have a pejorative sense necessarily, because, for instance, the Greeks had a fair amount of contact with Egypt. And yet they realized that Egypt was an ancient civilization, far older than theirs, with all kinds of knowledge that they themselves did not have. So they did not mean it in a sort of demeaning way to call the Egyptians barbarians. They were just different. The term begins to take on that more negative sense when the Greeks became involved in military confrontation with the Persian Empire. This is what the historian Herodotus, that's the main thrust of his first history in the Western tradition, is the wars of the Greeks and Persians. And when the Greeks managed to resist Xerxes' great invasion of Greece in the early 5th century, they were sort of carried away with exaltation, and they began to think of themselves as in some ways superior to these barbarians that they had just defeated. And so the term begins to take on some of the connotations that it has had ever since. From a Greek point of view, the Romans, when they encountered them, were barbaroi, they were barbarians. But the Romans, who took over so much from Greek culture, also took over this concept, and they then applied it to the peoples that they came into contact with who were different from them. People beyond their borders, and it had some of those same connotations as well. One of the readings that you had for today talked about the way in which ancient ethnography, the study of different peoples and their ways of life, tends to see people as static, as having always been the way that they are when they are discovered and observed by Greek and Roman ethnographers. And today we would say that that's just completely misguided, that these kinds of ethnic identities are anything but static, that they change all the time, that ultimately identity is a construction. People either construct it for themselves and think that they belong to a group, or other people construct it for them and say, you, in my eyes, belong in this category. But if it's a construction, then it's obviously very open to change. And another of the readings that you had for today, one of the two modern readings about the barbarians, the one that dealt with the barbarians that the Romans had to deal with, really emphasized just how malleable these identities were, particularly among the various barbarian peoples that the Romans had to sort of deal with in the last centuries of the empire. How a single successful war leader could gather large numbers of people to him, and ultimately out of that a group is formed that has a group identity. And once they have that identity, there's a tendency to then explain this away by creating some sort of a myth of a legendary founder that everybody is descended from. And modern historians can very often sort of deconstruct these mythologies and show how and when they were put together and why they chose to see them that way. So on the one hand, in Greek and Roman civilization and in Chinese civilization, you've got this tendency